Welcome back to the Demon Slayer Comparison Series. Today we'll cover episode 8 of the District Arc, which covers the entirety of chapters 87, 88, and 89. This episode was drop dead insane, so without further ado, let's get started. The episode kicks off with an anime-only depiction of Tanjiro jogging his way back to Nezuko's box, during which we get a short 15-second recap of what happened to her last episode, as well as some lines from Tanjiro being grateful that she's asleep. It's after he wishes Nezuko a good night's rest that the adaptation process starts for real, with Tanjiro closing up the box and getting ready to head out. The only thing that's really different here is that we can actually see Tanjiro repair the box strap this time, whereas in the manga it's already been patched up ahead of time. Unlike other chapters, the title page, or pages in this case, actually come after the story resumes with Tanjiro taking off, which means we'll be moving from page 1 all the way to page 5 now. This might change depending on which version you're reading. Viz Media for one has one extra page of a terribly photoshopped logo. Other versions might skip this, but some might have the pages beforehand completely colored, so that's a bonus. Before the first panel of page 5 actually starts though, we get some additional dialogue from our good pal Gyutaro here as he says how annoyed he is with how cool Uzui is. It's after that when he says his first line on page 5 with how different Uzui is from the rest of the Hashira he's fought thus far. The dialogue here is mostly the same, with the only major difference being that Daki chips in this time after Uzui says that they have an ignorant view of the world. Uzui's rebuttal to this new line is what continues the original dialogue on the next panel. As for the backstory of Uzui and his brother, UFOTABLE kinda does their own thing in this regard. They have a track record of making these scenes feel like they're right out of a picture book. It keeps our attention through long narrative sequences, and I for one welcome stuff like this. As we transition back into reality, we see Uzui huffing a little more now, making it a little more obvious for Gyutaro that the poison is indeed working. Likewise, after Gyutaro laughs a bit, Uzui now asks Gyutaro what he's laughing about before Gyutaro's lines continue on the same panel. And it's now where we get into our first skirmish of the day as Uzui charges in to fight the demonic duo. This is where things get a little complicated. To start, we have some missing attacks here. After Uzui does a 2-sword slash, which is really just a 1-sword slash in the anime, Daki is then supposed to send out an Obi strike after the two back away, but she never does that attack. In place of that though, after Uzui does a follow-up attack, we do get a better depiction of how Uzui got in close to do a center mass kick on Daki. During this kick, you might notice that Gyutaro is in the middle of backing up from Uzui, whereas in the manga, he's still relatively close by. Because he's closer in the manga, that might be why they collided one more time here. This collision isn't shown in the anime after all. After Uzui throws his ninja balls in a slightly different way, we get better depictions of how Gyutaro evaded the balls, but Daki did not, as after the explosion we get a blink and you'll miss it moment of Uzui slicing off Daki's neck yet again. Funny enough, around the time she's falling to the ground in pieces is actually around the time in the manga where she tries putting her head back on. The anime is probably better in this regard because it would defeat the purpose of Uzui trying to cut both of their heads off at the same time. Again, there are some minor changes here if you look closely enough, but these are the major ones. If it seems like there's a lack of side-by-side shots, it's because UFOTABLE has started to mix up the framing of their shots in favor of more dynamic camera angles. This is especially so because of all the fights we'll be seeing this episode. After the skirmish is over and Daki is holding her head in her hands yet again, it appears that it's already been reattached, but in the manga it seems like she's still having some issues. I assume we could still say that it's detached, but it's kinda hard to tell from this angle. Once again, the lines here are basically the same, and this is all the way up to where Inosuke and Zenko arrive. And yes, I'm still calling him Zenko, he's still got the makeup on. I've been calling him Zenko so much that I forgot even how to spell his original name. That aside, I do like how it transitions to Inosuke and Zenko from Uzui's shot. While the manga's shot might look similar, it's actually Daki that's looking at them here. After that is when Tanjiro arrives, and Uzui looks less surprised at their arrival this time, as if it's only natural that they would come. You would expect no less from his Sugu cult. This close shot of Tanjiro's face here is actually the shot that will end out chapter 87 before moving on to chapter 88 where Uzui's wives are guiding the evacuation effort. We have some anime exclusive stuff here. After we watch the residents of CG Village make their way out of the district, as well as some footage of Hinatsuru making her way to the battlefield, we see shots of every player on the field before Uzui says some extra flashy lines about how they all made such a flashy entrance. As you might have noticed, some of these shots came directly from the title page of chapter 88, as well as the reverse shot of Daki here. This evacuation sequence is really cool because it adds a lot of tension and reminds us that we're in the end game here, and it's after this sequence is done that we finally get into the commercial break. As far as the cuts go, both of them actually reside on page 3 of chapter 87 of the 2-page illustration showing its own depiction of all the contenders for this battle. As for Uzui, his shot is a little different though. You can now see all the injuries injuries that he's sustained thus far. Continuing the adaptation of Chapter 88, the lines that happen before the battle are pretty similar, although Tanjiro does exclaim his concern at Uzui being poisoned this time instead of just saying it in his head. In the manga, it does look like Daki is still having a hard time putting her head on straight though. As far as Uzui's rebuttal to Daki claiming how weak Uzui will be now that he's poisoned, Viz Media is a little more conservative in his lines. He never mentions that he's at the top of his game when he's poisoned, nor does he call Daki a dumbass. He calls her a demonette instead. I'm not sure if that's a real word or not, but it's kinda funny, so it's okay. In the anime though, we do get a rebuttal of a rebuttal as Daki calls out Uzui's bravado. It's after Uzui tells her to shut up that we continue Uzui's lines on the same panel saying that they shouldn't underestimate humans. It would be nice if Viz Media called his underling Suguko like they called Daki's belt and Obi, but other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. Again, the framing of some shots can be a little different. Things like how Tanjiro looks over his left shoulder instead of his right, the angle of Uzui's swords, but stuff like this is a little too trivial to be mentioned each time. While we're on the topic of trivial matters though, you might have noticed that at one point Tanjiro does look over his left shoulder and then looks over his right a little bit later in the manga. These are the sort of things I think I'll let you guys observe for yourselves. Now that everyone is assembled, we'll be starting up the fight once again. This time around, Zenko is a bit ahead of the game as we see some foreshadowing of him getting his stance ready before Daki attacks. It's really cool that since we get to see Zenko take off, we also get to watch how Inosuke just stands there looking at him all proud-like. According to him, that is his Suguko after all. In slow motion, we can really see how Zenko did this attack more clearly. As we all know by this point, Zenitsu's first form acts sort of like a pinball machine, jumping from one point to the next. One of his first jumping off points goes straight between Uzui and Daki to negate her attack before bouncing off at least one more point into Daki herself, essentially bringing her with him into his final jumping off point that would send them both through the ceiling. This attack in the manga is a bit different, but still comparable. Again, we don't actually see him take off, but I think we can assume that after this point right here is where he fully negated Daki's attack, and this point is where he grabbed Daki and sent her airborne at the same time. Every point besides that seemingly had no purpose unless there were some random Obi strands over there. I don't think that Daki was actually at this point because the attack came from behind Uzui, but I still assume it's possible. We also don't see them both collide with the roof like we can in the manga. Either we just don't get that depiction, or they flew through an already existing hole in the roof. Maybe it was the one that Gyutaro's sickle made earlier. Who knows? Though the anime does show them both flying through the air this time, which is pretty cool. After Inosuke takes off by going to the right instead of the left, Gyutaro says that he won't let them hurt his sister, and I'm sure he does feel that way, but based on other translations and my own Japanese knowledge, I think Crunchyroll should have said something more along the lines of him saying that they are unable to beat his sister. But this is obviously up for debate. Either way, after Zenko demands an apology from Daki, we see her acting a little confused as to what Zenko's even talking about before he continues his lecture to her. As Daki is refuting Zenko's lecture with her own, we get some more of that picture book action from earlier, although it's a little different this time. See, for this one it seems like they purposely limited the scene to just threes, only to apply frame blending techniques to it afterwards. I say this because in between every 3 frames, at least for this CGI butterfly here, there's obvious ghosting from the frame prior, which is a clear-cut sign of frame blending. This is especially noticeable if you look at the wing of the butterfly. Some could argue that this is done on force though, as there's almost always a duplicate frame of all drawings appearing in their complete state. Leave it to UFOTABLE to take a technique used to salvage low frame rate footage and make it look more artistic. For reference, I took the time to redo this footage so you can see what it might look like with normal frame sampling. It's not perfect, but you can kind of see the difference. Moving on from that, we now get to see another partial transformation from Daki when we watch her third eyeball start to form, as well as hear the siblings' voices overlap like they would at the end of page 12. Just like that page, they perfectly dissolve these two cuts into one another. All the techniques that we've seen this entire series have been so creative that it seems to have pushed Tanjiro over the edge a little bit as he's trying to get rid of his goosebumps. Most of this section is pretty dead on, but we do lose the depiction of Uzui grabbing Tanjiro by his haori before flinging him up into the air. This is the move that'll put us right back in Sakuga Central as Tanjiro and Uzui versus Gyutaro, as well as Zenko and Inosuke versus Daki, officially starts up. As such, most of the manga content from here on out will be mostly fighting panels with framing that can vary wildly compared to the anime, so just be prepared for that. From here we'll be jumping back and forth between the two battles quite rapidly, and the pacing of each respective battle is unlike anything thus far in Demon Slayer, so let's break it down piece by piece. After Uzui yanks Tanjiro out of the way, he and Gyutaro start a flurry of sword-on-sickle blows. A lot of the engagements from here on out alternate between 1s and 2s as the situation calls for it. bit. For example, Uzui's first exchange with Gyutaro was done on 2s and was bumped up to 1s a little later as they both started to speed up. Now obviously there are a lot of collisions that aren't technically in the manga, but are part of the same exchange on that panel. Naturally, I won't be able to cover every single individual collision in this episode, as we could basically be here all day, but with that being said, as the swarm of Obi comes raining down, obscuring Uzui's battle and hindering Tanjiro, we see some additional slashes from him before he starts holding up 2 at a time. In the manga, this collision can be seen in the background during Uzui's fight. It's as Tanjiro is holding up the raining Obi that we move over to battlefield number 2 as Inosuke is just now joining Zenko to fight Daki. This part is a bit of an enigma. In the anime, we watch Inosuke appear and comment on how Daki has 3 eyes, but none of this is actually in the manga. The resulting dialogue about how Daki can see every move they make and Inosuke being annoyed with Daki's voice are still there, but that's not what makes this confusing. What makes it confusing is the fact that the manga depicts it as if this battle has been going on for quite some time now. They didn't have any of these particular wounds earlier, so they must have just gotten them in this battle. This is a little interesting because timing-wise, this whole sequence is a little out of sync with the anime, but I guess it does make a cooler last shot for the end of the chapter. Speaking of which, after Gyutaro speaks ill of Uzui's Suguko, this is where we end chapter 88. We're about to see some really big changes in this next chapter, but before we actually get into the chapter, we get our first anime exclusive content in the form of some sick Sakuga action with Zenko and Inosuke. I assume we could surmise that this happened before this panel on chapter 88, but it's anyone's guess. During said Sakuga, we get some additional lines of Inosuke talking smack while fighting off Daki's attacks. It's one of those moments where you look at the visuals first and read the subtitles later. Here you can really see the differences between Inosuke and Zenko's movements. Compared to Zenko, Inosuke has a lot more gusto in how he moves, while Zenko is far more conservative in how he tackles the situation. I've talked a lot about Inosuke's beast breathing before, but I failed to mention his movement itself. He's definitely the most mobile out of the trio, as most of the time his limbs are fully extended, giving his movements this very freeform feel, as if he's improvising on the spot. His wild side really comes to life during these attacks, and it shows especially when he does balled up cartwheels or lands on all fours. Moving on with the story, this is kind of around the time where the adaptation of chapter 89 starts. I say kind of because the timing of the last panel here is a little strange. Now, this is a continuation of Inosuke and Zenko's fight, but since there are already blood blades mixed in here, it does throw the timing off a little bit. After all, these blood blades are supposed to come a little later, as when they're fighting it, Inosuke is supposed to comment as much. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the beginning of the chapter when Daki starts destroying the roof and consequently rains fire down on Uzui and Tanjiro. Uzui is a little more concerned about this fact in the manga, as he has some unadapted thoughts about how the debris is hindering his vision. Don't get me wrong, we still get the depiction of the debris falling down, but it just comes a little later on after we get some anime exclusive Sakuga of Uzui and Gyutaro's fight. This fight does a much better job in showing that Tanjiro and Uzui have to consistently put up with Obi attacks at the same time. We'll cover the amazing movement on display here in just a bit, but for the time being, you might have noticed that Uzui also threw out some additional ninja balls this time. It might just seem like a quaint little addition to the battle at first, but it's these balls that will effectively change the scene composition after the debris falls, as this is what sets everything around them on fire. Now we're at the point where the debris finally comes crashing down, and in the manga, it looks like Uzui slashed some of the rubble that was falling towards him, but the anime skips past that part entirely, right to where Gyutaro jumps through the remains to get closer to Uzui. Due to the fire from Uzui's attack, this is where the scene composition really changes. With the reddish light that illuminates both Gyutaro and Uzui's faces, this scene now feels more cinematic than ever. And once again, the engagement here has been extended with some of the highest quality Sakuga that UFOTABLE can offer. This particular engagement, all the way up to when Tanjiro comes in to help, is about 7 panels long. Besides the depiction of Gyutaro's blades coming back to hit Uzui, this is the most disconnected the anime has ever been from the manga. There really isn't much to compare here, as the Sakuga on display has its own unique choreography. As for how UFOTABLE animated these 7 panels, well, if you were already having a hard time breathing, then you probably won't be ready for what comes next. So to start, the majority of movement here is done on 2s, but like many other things before it that were done on 2s, the effect work as done on 1s picks up the slack with slashes that don't always have a direct drawn movement attached to them. If it's kind of hard to follow, this is partly why. That being said, the movements here are quite interesting to dissect. As you can see, Gyutaro has this ferocious hunchback way of fighting with these bendy movements that are highly unpredictable. Like Uzui and Inosuke said, he really does fight like a mantis. In a weird way, he kind of reminds me of how Drunk Rock Lee fights. He's got these attacks that lead into long pauses of limp limbs, making it really hard to guess how the next strike will come. As you can see, Uzui is having a hard time getting a read on these movements as he's constantly being pushed back. He even drops both of his swords at one point during the onslaught of blows. Really, if you look closely at all the engagements these two have had up to this point, Gyutaro has always been the one pushing Uzui back, and that's no different now. Somehow Uzui is still holding his own though. If Gyutaro reminds me of Drunk Rock Lee, then Uzui reminds me of Athletic Berserker. However, the brawling nature of Uzui makes it fascinating to see how he moves so fluidly. Leave it to UFOTABLE to effortlessly show the fighting style of both fighters without breaking up the feeling of consistent action. Now, mise-en-scène might not be the most appropriate term for animation, but it's hard not to appreciate all the assets on display for this cut right here in particular. It's absolutely gorgeous. As the camera shakes around, we see Obi strikes still flying down in the background. All the dynamic movement here, whether it's effect work or otherwise, can be very overwhelming at times, but if you take the time to internalize all that's actually here, it's quite breathtaking. The fire, the dust, the little chunks of debris still falling, the lighting, the sword glow, the entire render of the dilapidated building in the background with broken shoji doors and missing floorboards. It's all so chaotic, but so beautiful at the same time. Really, I could look at this shot all day, but let's move on. It's during that chaos that you can see the anime-only depiction of Gyutaro sending out the blood blades that would inevitably circle back and try and hit Uzui. Likewise, we now get a depiction of Tanjiro realizing this as he goes in to help. This is more or less when we get back in tune with the manga, as Tanjiro processes in his head how to properly use his water breathing before dispersing the strength of Gyutaro's blades. It's after Tanjiro saves the day that Uzui uses his sound-breathing fifth form string performance with this cool compositional value before spinning his blades around like mad as explosions pop off all around him and he goes flying past the camera and onto the outside world. We never clearly see them leave the building in the manga, so this is nice to see. As for the attack itself, these blades of Uzui's are spinning so fast that we can't really even see them, it's just the effect work. They spin so fast that they almost immediately dispelled Gyutaro's blood attacks in just a couple frames. Really, these spinning blades will be more of a constant going forward, although in the anime you will see Uzui do a few standard slashes here and there. After Gyutaro relays that this attack won't mean a thing, this is normally when the Obi would come in to stop Uzui's sound breathing attack before Tanjiro saves the day again, but instead Gyutaro uses his own blood abilities to fight back without the help of his sister. See, the event of Tanjiro saving Uzui again actually comes in later this time, as we now skip ahead a few pages to Inosuke and Zenko's battle with Daki. Don't worry, we'll be back to this in just a bit. While Inosuke and Zenko's fight is only 4 panels in the manga, UFOTABLE is really starting to show the synergy these two are bringing to the table. Amidst the insane camera work, this is where the blood blades actually make an entrance and emerge from the roof into their battle as Inosuke dodges them with wild somersaults and the like before Zenko covers him and they both charge in together. Just like those 7 panels from earlier with Gyutaro and Uzui's fight, the 4-panel battle here kind of does its own thing movement-wise, although the dialogue of Inosuke finally mentioning the blood blades properly is still here. Again, I'm sure I'm not the only one that looked at the visuals first and then read the subtitles later. There's just too much going on. If it's one thing that this scene has solidified, it's the fact that UFOTABLE loves to put their characters right into our faces in the middle of their attacks before showing the rest of the attack. They do this multiple times with Inosuke in just one cut alone. Go back and look at some of the other high-budget cuts and you'll see exactly what I mean. At the end of this cut right here is when the Obi shrouds the camera and transitions perfectly into the Obi heading into Uzui and Tanjiro's battle. This is where we rewind back to the pages we skipped over earlier as Tanjiro tries to stop all third-party attacks that would hinder Uzui. Heck, we can even see him charging in during this shot right here. The lines that Tanjiro internalized as he struck those Obi are roughly the same, although Viz Media does say that Tanjiro's objective is to distract Gyutaro when it should be to wave off any incoming attacks. It's fine either way, but it's still worth mentioning. After some more sick Sakuga from Uzui, we get the shot of Tanjiro being forced back by some Obi attacks, although in the manga it is kinda hard to distinguish whether it was the Obi or the blood blades that were flying nearby. After he backs up from the following Obi strikes, we get some more spinning blade action from Uzui, and right after that is when Hinatsuru arrives to save the day with the most dangerous ninja tool I have ever seen. Though this time in the anime we can now see how she's still having a hard time recovering from her poisoning. Now I realize I glossed over Uzui's 2 last little Sakuga moments, but I really like this shot in particular. It might not seem like much after everything we've seen, but it's actually the first time we can really take a breath while seeing very clearly what the situation is like. After Hinatsuru fires the kunai launcher, everything up to when Gyutaro deflects the kunai is basically the same, except Uzui and Gyutaro have switched places here. Now this is when Gyutaro uses his Blood Demon Art Rampant Arc Rampage to dispel the CG kunai in front of him. While most of this is just a loop that repeats every 3 frames, it still looks insane as the graphic design looks quite similar to the bend version of Blood Sickles. This is when Uzui charges in while Gyutaro is doing that attack. This is all pretty much the same, although Viz Media does make Gyutaro call Uzui a she. I suppose they assumed he was talking about Hinatsuru, but it really should have been about Uzui. Or he could have been talking about both of them. They are both shinobi after all. Whichever it is, this is just another one of those lost in context things, and it's not really that big a deal. After Uzui slashes Gyutaro's legs off, we get the anime-only depiction of some kunai blades actually flying out of Uzui's body during this slash. It's after this when Tanjiro comes in with the hopefully finishing slash against Gyutaro. Gyutaro's lines are a tad different depending on which translation you look at, but that's pretty much par for the course with this guy's lines. As Tanjiro gets closer to Gyutaro's neck, this is when we get an Attack on Titan cliffhanger and the episode ends. It's also where chapter 89 ends, which means it's numbers time. Episode 8 had a runtime of about 24 minutes with around 20 minutes of canonical content. During this time, there were just about 328 unique cuts. These cuts adapted 3 chapters and 57 pages respectively, with 204 panels. That leaves us with 124 anime exclusive cuts this time. This episode was absolutely insane, and there was a lot going on, so I couldn't quite cover everything I was hoping to. There was an onslaught of effects and techniques employed that I didn't necessarily cover in this video, but I did in previous episodes, so make sure you all check those out if you haven't already. Getting these out on time is pretty difficult, so if there's anything that I got wrong or missed, that's what you guys are for. Comment below what you thought of this comparison and breakdown. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like and share it with a friend. And hey, maybe subscribe while you're at it for more anime comparison videos. Well, that's it for me. As always, I hope you all have a fantastic day. This is Registry, signing off.